blocks of reading. Then we're going to talk about the pathway to reading comprehension, which if you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen my infographic. If not, definitely go check it out. It's also in your workbook. We're going to talk about the sound wall versus word wall. We're also going to talk about what to do when students struggle. We're talking about reading intervention, my definition of it, and what your definition should also be. We're going to talk about different reading interventions that I use and what student profile they fit. We're also going to be talking about different considerations for intervention groups. We're going to talk about some offerings that I have and answer a couple questions in the time that we have. After this, you'll also get a replay or a recording that I've pre-recorded, which answers a couple more questions, and the questions are my answers are a little bit more in depth. If you have questions after that, just go ahead and click reply to my email. Let's go ahead and get started. This is on your workbook, page 2. So this is the Historically Responsive Literacy Framework by Dr. Muhammad, and you have her book, and it's a clickable link if you are looking at the PDF. If not, no worries. There are 4 main principles or pursuits or learning goals: identity, skills, intellect, and critically. And the reason I put this here is because I feel like it's really important for us to think about these things when we are talking about intervention. Oftentimes when we're talking about intervention, we don't consider these things. We just kind of pick up a curriculum and we do what the curriculum says. But I think it's important for us to take a pause and to think about each of these different components when we are teaching students in intervention groups. And here's why. The first point is identity. So for students to be fully engaged in school, they have to first find it relevant, and that starts with their own identity. So you can think about this by asking yourself, how does your own teaching, how does your own learning help your students to learn about themselves and also learn about others? Because it's also important for students to learn about people that are different than themselves, as much as it is important for them to learn about themselves and to see themselves represented. We have to make sure when we make intervention materials and when we're pulling from materials that we're making intervention relevant to students by choosing text that students identify with and can connect to. The next one is skills. Sometimes we think that when we add identity or when we add voice and freedom of expression, that somehow we're not including skills, and that just isn't true. So you can have it all. You can have voice and expression and choice and skills. That is a skill that we're teaching, especially when we are working with students of color, because oftentimes in our communities, we are told and taught not to speak up and not to voice our opinion. We are seen and we are not heard. The next one is intellect. So we have to be thinking about, what do we want our students to become smarter about? This has to be at the forefront as we plan. Of course, we want to teach comprehension, we want to teach fluency, we want to teach phonics, phonemic awareness, and all the other building blocks of readings and so on and so forth. But what else do we want them to become smarter about? That has to be at the forefront of our mind as we're teaching. Critically or criticality is helping students to read, write, and think in active ways. We don't want them to be passive learners. When you ask a question and there's one right answer, we don't want that. We don't want them to be passive consumers. We don't want them to just take in the news or take what we say and just run with it. We want them to be able to really engage and question what we say. And that really goes back to the different skills that we're teaching them. And so that's why I think it's important to start this webinar with this historically responsive literacy framework, because that really should be shaping everything that we're doing with students. If you guys have questions about that, make sure that you guys email me or DM me. The next part of this webinar is talking about the building blocks of reading, and this is important, especially as we talk about that pathway to comprehension, which we'll get into in just a moment. So building blocks of reading. Everyone kind of just thinks that, kids start to learn how to read, but they're building blocks. So, and they're written in order. So of course, I didn't write oral language here, but that one really is at the forefront. So oral language comes first. And then you have phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. This is on page 3 of your workbook. So the first one, phonemic awareness. You have this definition on your book. It's really the ability for someone to be able to listen and manipulate sounds just by listening and hearing. So this has nothing to do with print. And I posted an infographic on my Instagram, which actually goes over this as well. So this has nothing to do with print. You're not looking at letters. You're just manipulating sounds by listening. And when I'm going over these definitions, I'm not thinking about any neurodiversity. I'm just going over what the actual definition is. I'm not talking about any accommodations that students might need or anything like that. That's a whole separate webinar. So just keep that in mind as I'm going over this. Of course, there are times when students might need accommodations to access some of the skills that we're talking about. So for this again does not involve print, it's just sound. So an example would be you say the word cat, and then you ask the student, what happens when you take the k and make it a p? The student should say pat. Or you might say, what happens if I give you the word make? What happens when you take the and change it to k? They should say cake. They should be able to manipulate these words, the sounds in the words, to make new words. And they should be able to do it pretty rapidly and pretty easily, depending on the words you're giving them and depending on which grade level they're in. Now, phonics is the next one, and people confuse phonics and phonemic awareness, excuse me, quite often. So phonics is when you're dealing with the print. So it's a sound symbol relationship to begin to recognize the words and start to really decode the words. So phonemic awareness focuses only on the sounds of a word. Phonics focuses on the relationship of sounds and letters. So what words are forming when I hear these sounds. The next one is fluency, and that's the ability to read with speed, accuracy, and proper expression. So I think of this one as not reading like a robot is how I explain it to my kids, and I have a fun video from Go Noodle that we usually look at. And kids have to be able to read fluently, whether they're reading aloud or whether they're reading silently. The next one is vocabulary, and oftentimes people really miss this one. Vocabulary is key. If kids have a lack of exposure to vocabulary, it often becomes problematic, or not often, it becomes problematic later on when they're trying to comprehend text, because they have to be able to define what words are when they're reading. And some of it is lack of exposure, right? If we're here in California and kids aren't exposed to tornadoes and we're reading about tornadoes, they might not know what that is. That's why we have to teach those things, because they're reading a text and I'm like, well, what is that? What is a hurricane? Because they haven't experienced that. That's not going to live. What is a basement? Because we don't have basements, or most people don't have basements here. Things like that. So that's why teaching vocabulary is important. Previewing those books with them, previewing those terms with them. There's different ways that you can ensure that kids have this vocabulary. But vocabulary is an important step in the building blocks of reading. And the last thing that kids get to is comprehension. And comprehension is the understanding and interpretation, so the making meaning of the print, being able to think deeply about what they're reading, making the connections, and making sure they're able to decode what they're reading, of course. And I'm sorry, this was all on page 3 of your workbook, if you're following along. And all of the definitions of this were written down. So you can go ahead and go to the next page of your workbook, which is page 4. Sorry, that just clicked off. Let me get back to where we were. So we are on page 4 of your workbook, and we're talking about the path to reading comprehension. And so you have this visual. And it's not in this color. Yours is in purple, but this is actually on my my Instagram. And so the building blocks build on top of each other. You can't just jump to one without a student mastering the other. If a student is struggling in one area, you have to teach the prior skills as if they are prerequisites, because they are. They cannot get to reading comprehension without all of these other skills. If you have questions about a specific student, or if you have questions about where your student is, I want you to reach out to me. I'm happy to coach you about specific students. That's one of the things that I offer, but I want to talk to you about how you really read this. And you have to start with the phonemic awareness and the phonics, and that's when you get into the decoding. So that's the sounding out of unfamiliar words. And then we really get into that word recognition, and they have to be able to do this automatically, so with automaticity. And then you get into that fluency, and that's that reading with expression, accuracy, and rate. So accuracy is like making sure that they're reading the words correctly. Rate is how fast they're reading it. And it's important to mention that, they're not reading it, they're not speed reading it, but reading it with an appropriate rate and with appropriate expression, paying attention if they need to take a pause, or if they need to slow down, just really being mindful, if they need to sound happy, sad, paying attention to those things. And then getting into that reading comprehension, taking that meaning from print. This is how you get to comprehension. So if a student is lacking in another area, you're not going to be able to get down to this reading comprehension just yet. If a student doesn't have fluency, you can't get to reading comprehension. If students can't read words with automaticity, you can't get to fluency. Do you see how the building blocks work? If I can't decode words, then I can't read with automaticity. But if I don't have phonemic awareness, if I can't manipulate sounds in words, how can I start decoding words? Because I can't even distinguish the different sounds that are in words. So that's what we mean by building blocks. These things build off of one another, and you can't get down to them until you can't get down to the other step until you have the other step. And that's going to bring us into two slides from here. But first, I want to talk about this sound wall versus word wall. It's on page 5 of your workbook. You have this visual, this graphic, and I will read some of this out loud to you. It just talks about the benefits of a word wall. And I just want to share that this might come as a surprise, not because you don't know it, but just I don't think that we think about things this way, but we learn to read through our ears, through what we hear. So a sound wall is a space in the classroom to display the different sounds heard in speech. And there are 2 parts of a sound wall that can be displayed. There's consonant sounds, so every sound that's on a vowel, and then there's vowel sounds. And if you teach the primary grade, you should display both, but again, you know your class. And if you teach upper grades, you should focus on the vowel sounds. Those are going to be most applicable for the students. But remember, it's sounds, it's not the letters, okay? And you should only start to display them as you're teaching them. And I won't get too much into it because there's lots of different ways to organize a sound wall. And if you're really interested in this topic, make sure that you send me an email after this and you let me know that you're interested in this topic, because I'm happy to go and go into depth on this. I'm actually going to send something out to my newsletter subscribers and go into depth about this topic. So make sure you're subscribed if you aren't. This is a picture of part of my sound wall in my office. And the way I do it is I have consonant sounds and vowel sounds. So you can see I have the CK here and the TH, but I also have the OY and the OI. I have it all up there. But I also have pictures, right? Because I'm thinking about my English language learners. I'm thinking about my emerging readers. And what's so great about it is, you teach students different reading patterns, and then they start to use that. So no is not a word that they would necessarily sound out, but they know that KN and that silent K. And so they know that spelling pattern. And so they know how to go up there and look for that word or look for the word night. And they also know how to look for the picture. And this can go all the way up into, 11th grade science or chemistry or algebra or whatever have you. A sound wall is applicable to any subject and any grade level that you teach. And if you are having a hard time thinking of how could I have this in my classroom, or how could I convince, a 12th grade teacher to have this in their history class, let me know. I'm happy to brainstorm that with you. The next thing is the main reason why you guys probably came. And this is on page 6 of your workbook. This is, what do I do when students struggle? Well, let me tell you. So the way that you read this chart is you need to look in this black box here. And then from this area, that's the area that your student is struggling in. And then from there, you're going to follow the arrow. So for example, if your student has poor comprehension, you're going to look here, poor comprehension ? Then you need to work on fluency. And here's the thing. Oftentimes when students struggle with something, what we do is we work on what? We just beat them over the head with comprehension. Or if a student struggles with decoding, we beat them over the head with decoding. But no. What we need to do is look at the building blocks of reading, because that's why they're the building blocks of reading. And that's why we actually went over this, because it's so important to know the building blocks of reading, because they're building blocks. And you can't just work on comprehension if someone's stuck on comprehension. You can't just work on fluency if that's what they're stuck on. You have to work on the previous building blocks. So this is how you read this. If your student is stuck on poor comprehension, you need to go back to fluency. And you're saying, Kiona, but what if they're stuck on fluency? Oh, if they're stuck on fluency, then you need to go back to that word recognition, because that means they're not recognizing words with automaticity. But Kiona, they're not doing that either. Oh, well, go to the poor word recognition. They need that phonics and decoding. But that's not there either. Okay, so poor phonics and decoding, you had to go back to the very first building block of phonemic awareness. And if they're not getting phonemic awareness, then I would really look at that oral language and talk to your SLP on campus, your speech linguist pathologist, and brainstorm some ideas, because beyond that, that's really where that breakdown comes down, is that oral language communication. Again, if you have questions about further reading this chart, or you're like, okay, well, but what are the strategies for comprehension, or what are the strategies for fluency or word recognition, phonics, or phonemic awareness? Don't worry, I have you. I have webinars coming up for these things. And I also have infographics and everything. But if you want something before then, make sure you sign up for my newsletter, because I'm going to be having things coming out there. All right. This is not in your workbook, but it's key, so I wanted to talk about it. And I wanted to have the definition up. It is not intervention unless students are also getting reading instruction from their core teacher, and I cannot say this enough. Intervention needs to be systematic, multisensory, and targeted to student needs. And I wanted to say that because of what I just talked about on that last slide. You know, we can be working with, let's say it's me. You can be working with Kiona, and Kiona has poor fluency. But if you are just working on reading comprehension with me, that's not an intervention, because that's not what I need. Does that make sense? I'm asking if that makes sense. You can't even respond to me. So, all right, moving right along. Reading interventions I know and I use. Let's talk about them. We're going to be talking about foundations, Barton's, Just Words, Wilson's, Lips, LLI, Reading A to Z, and Raskets. And not all of these do I love, but we're going to talk about them. This, again, is not workbook specific, but I'm actually going to email out these because these are clickable links. I want you guys to be able to go exactly to these websites if you so choose. So, getting into it. Foundations. Foundations is actually a whole class curriculum, but it is multisensory. It's direct instruction. It can be used as an intervention as well for students needing more support in decoding and coding. It is for kids in grades K through 3rd, but they did recently come out as of last year, I believe, a preschool curriculum. I don't have experience using it, but I have experience using the kinder, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade curriculum. The curriculum also works on comprehension as well. A lot of people do not know that. This is an Orton-Gillingham program. Orton-Gillingham is a type of program. It is not necessarily actual intervention, if that makes sense. And then the next one is Barton's. And Barton's focuses on reading and spelling. So decoding and encoding. Again, OG or Orton-Gillingham. Just Words is the next one. And this is another Foundations Wilson's program in that wheelhouse. It's multisensory spelling program for students in 4th grade and above who are just below average. And the thing about this, I wanted to include it, but the thing about this one is this is not a program for students who are far below grade level. If you're interested in this program, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help. You figure out if this is a good fit for your students. There's a specific type of test that you want to give your students. And that's why I'm going to send out the links. That way you guys can see this is really, Just Words is not a tier 3 intervention. It is more a tier 2 intervention. You can have like up to 15 students in this particular program. I have used Just Words before. Wilson's is an intensive reading program. It's multisensory. It's for students in 2nd grade and above, all the way through adult. And it needs to be done for 45 minutes, 4 times a week. And when you go to a training, they actually tell you it needs to be done 60 to 90 minutes, multiple times a week. But when I went to my training, I knew my site and I said, well, what if that's not possible? What's the least amount of time you can do it? And they said 45 minutes, 4 times a week. Lips is the next program. And what I like about it is it works specifically on phoneme sequencing and phonemic awareness, targeting reading, spelling, and speech. And then there's LLI, and that one is not my favorite, but I want to talk about it because a lot of schools use it. This program focuses on reading comprehension, and it should only be done with students who are reading at a level D on F&P, Fontes and Pinnell system, or higher. Honestly, I would say higher, like you should be a strong, solid reader who only needs comprehension work. I know a lot of people say things like, but it has, phonics. And yeah, I mean, sure, it has phonics in it, but it is not, I personally would not use it for phonics. It doesn't have a strong enough phonics component to it. I have used the books on top of using my foundations. Don't get me wrong, the books are great, but it's not something that I would use for anyone who's struggling with phonemic awareness or phonics or things like that. So comprehension intervention. Every intervention has their place, right? There's different building blocks of reading. So if a student is struggling with comprehension, if not if a student is struggling with comprehension, if a student needs to work on answering who, what, when, where, why questions and has solid comprehension but needs to work on that, LLI would be your jam. Then I want to talk about reading A to Z and RAS kids, because that's something that can be done during distance learning. It's something I've used outside of distance learning, but it also can replace LLI during distance learning. I've really enjoyed it, and so I wanted to bring it up, and I wanted to link it here. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I talk about my offering and before I talk about move into the Q&A and then wrap it on up are intervention group considerations. You need to consider time, frequency, content, size, assessments, and common sense. And what do I mean by all of these things? Let's talk about it. So for intervention groups, you need to consider how much time does the intervention take? So like Wilson's, I knew that I couldn't do Wilson's because I can't pull groups for 45 minutes and get through and see all of my kids that I need to be seeing. So I knew that wasn't the right, it may be a good intervention for some students, but it wasn't the right intervention for me. I just didn't have the time to commit to it in the roles that I currently serve. So you need to consider the time that you have, the time that you're going to have to see students. You also need to consider how frequently are you going to be able to meet with students and how frequently should you be meeting with students. What is the content? Like LLI, is it appropriate for the student? Is it not? Is Foundations appropriate for the student? Is it not? Do you need more phonemic awareness in something? Then maybe Barton's is your go-to. Doesn't mean an intervention is bad or one is good. Sometimes that is true, but not all the times is that the case. Size, do I need an intervention that can be done with a bigger group, or do I need one that can be, that is more specific for one-on-one? And you need to make sure that you are progress monitoring. I wanted to put that on there because it's not an intervention if you're not progress monitoring, because how will you know when they're ready for the next level if they need to go back? You need to make sure that they are mastering concepts. You are teaching to mastery. That is so important. For intervention groups, I really don't recommend more than 3 to 4, especially for K through 2, really K through 5 if you can. And then common sense, because yes, the intervention curriculum is there, but like I said, I do Foundations, but I also bring in some of the LLI books just to get practice reading, and I do the decodable readers on reading A to Z. So like you can mix, I don't want to say mix programs, but you can bring in some other things. Like I can bring in those books from there and give my kids practice reading. All right, so now I'm going to bring in this offer. If you like what you've heard, if you want to stay up to date with all of my offers and get discounts on courses that I'm offering, I have a RECA course coming up that's going to be offered, sneak peeks on things for me, freebies for me, automatic access to the recordings of webinars, tips and advice from me for families, things that you can send out for families. I know that I'm going to give you guys just a sneak peek for attending live, that I am going to be sending out something for families to sign up to get access to free read alouds from me, as well as some access to some early intervention. I don't even know what I want to call it, but some early intervention materials from me that are free for families. So if you want to sign up to get access and sneak peeks to that and to pass along to your families and such like that, make sure that you sign up for my newsletter. I will drop that information in the chat in a little bit. It also is on your workbook. So without further ado, let me drop that in the chat. Give me a second. Okay, that should have popped up in the chat now. Sign up for my newsletter. I will drop that information in the chat in a little bit. It also is on your workbook. So without further ado, let me. Okay, so I dropped that in the chat. And now let's move on to some questions. Sorry, let me move on to my question slide. Technical difficulties. First time doing this live. Okay. So people submitted questions I got about 10 people that submitted questions, and I grouped them into 6, and I'm going to answer some of them live here. So if you're still here, thank you for being here. Here we go. So the first one was, how do you involve families in intervention? So what I shared was that I send home weekly emails, and they're translated as needed with highlights of what students are working on. And if not emails, I send snapshots to teachers to put in their weekly emails. I also send home reading snapshots every time students are assessed, not for progress monitoring, but every time students have like their big reading assessment where we talk about what reading level they're on. I also talk about in the reading assessment, not just their reading level, but their strengths, their areas of growth, progress, things that they can do at home. And I send home one literacy handout. I also use the Talking Points app, which is awesome, to communicate in the language that families prefer, and it allows work-life balance because I can set up when I want to get notifications and when I don't. So it's like office hours when I'm in office, when I'm not. The next question was, which programs am I using online? I'm using a lot. But Seesaw really is my home base. I post all my things on there. So I post my boom cards on there, and I have a reel where I talked about that. I use boom cards for foundations-based boom cards. And I'm starting to make my own, so I'm going to talk to you guys about that too. I use foundations, I use Raz Kids, I use guided readers. I'm using Blast Off to reading, from sounds to spelling, learning at the primary Pons curriculum. And not all of these are interventions, but those are the main things that I'm using, and I'm adapting them, and some require more adapting than others. And if you're curious about which ones I'm using for what, or which ones I have to adapt more, definitely let me know. 2 more questions, and then we are going to be all done. So one question was, what has been working best for you to support your emerging bilinguals or English language learners during remote learning? So I feel like I kind of semi-answered this question, but using the Talking Points app, you can upload documents. It's an app, but you can also use it on the computer, and it allows other teachers to also be on your account. It has a ton of languages like Arabic, Japanese, Korean, etc. I also use DeepL to translate my documents, but Google Docs now has a feature that I recently found out that can be pretty accurate, at least in Spanish. I also have ELD groups twice a week with my students, K through 5. And I looked at their LPAC scores, which is our state test. And I went with the students that had the lowest scores. But there are benefits also to working with students who are pretty close to reclassifying. I just didn't have the capacity to work with all the students. We have over 109 students at our school who are currently classified as emerging bilingual. So I also post my lessons on my website and email them to families. So those are some things that I'm currently doing to try to support my English language learners. Some families have reoccurring meetings with me, and I meet with them on Zoom and kind of just like share. We also have ELAC meetings, and I try to attend those. We actually have one tonight that I'm getting ready to go to, which is why this webinar had to be so quick. So yeah, there actual recorded webinar, there are a couple more questions I'm answering, like how can I describe how language development influences reading development, and what would I say are some of the necessary steps for reading success for families and teachers, and then when implementing a reading intervention, how much role should teachers play versus families? Those are the other questions that I'm answering. So if you lasted this long, thank you so much. I'm going to drop another link in the chat to, if you give me a second, I'm so sorry, you guys. This is my first time doing this. This was actually really fun. When I first thought about doing this, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it like this. I was just originally going to have it using PowerPoint Live, but this was not bad at all. So I definitely would do something like this again. I just wanted to drop a couple links for you guys. My website, and then also to, if anyone wants to email me, I am dropping that in the chat too. So feel free to email me. Oh, I didn't spell my email wrong. Right. But that's my website. That is my Instagram. I'm always responding in like voice notes and try to make it as personal as possible. And then I'm fixing my email right now. It's at gmail.com. My goodness. Oh, thank you guys for coming. And that is all.